Hi, everyone. Welcome. It is Tuesday and it is right at noon, July 20th. Thank you all for being here and joining me at the table. We'll give everybody a couple of minutes to jump on. And while we do that, I will quickly introduce myself. My name is Barbie Winterbottom. I am the founder and CEO of the Business of HR, and I've got about 20 some odd years, won't get too specific, of experience in working in the people space. And so now I have my own firm where I work with individuals. So I coach individual HR folks as well as work with organizations, helping them with culture transformation, talent acquisition transformation, and lots of other fun things. Joining me today, I'm super excited to introduce Dr. Diem Mooney. And Diem has such an amazing story to share. And I've been following him on LinkedIn for a while. And I got the nerve to ask him if he would join us on the show today. And here he is. So very excited about that. Before we jump into our conversation, a little bit of housekeeping. So if you've ever participated in a LinkedIn live session before, you may know that the technology that pushes out the live stream, it only allows comments to come in one way. So for all of you who are joining us, please share your comments and questions with us through the chat function. We'll see them as they come in. We will be able to answer them verbally in the show. We will not be able to answer them in the actual chat while we're doing the live show. We can certainly comment after the fact through the chat, but during the live show, we're not able to comment back through the chat. But we do love to see your comments. We love to see your questions, and I will throw them across the screen as they come in so that we can both see them and answer any questions that you might have, or share any light bulb moments of comments that you might have. So with that, I will get us started. So welcome, Diem. Thank you for being here and taking time out. I know you have an incredibly busy schedule with all the exciting work you're doing. So thank you for joining me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
I'm going to jump right in because I think we have so much to talk about. And I think our audience and listeners and folks watching are really going to benefit from hearing more about you and your story and the work you do. And how you've brought all the elements of who you are into the work you do, which I think is so fascinating and what everyone really needs to do. So I'm going to read something. So you self-describe, and you put this out there on LinkedIn, so I'm not sharing any secrets or anything that you haven't already shared with the world. But Diem self-describes as a tattooed, autistic, learning impaired, speech impaired, non-binary, queer, redheaded, dreadheaded, Black, Hispanic, first-generation American, disabled veteran who grew up homeless with no mentors or connections. He wears cheap sweats or t-shirts 99% of the time, and usually about 10 years younger than their colleagues. I would love to break down each and every one of these elements that makes you this amazing individual, but we would be here for far too long. So what I would love to hear from you is how did you discover all of these amazing things about yourself as you grew up? And then how have you leveraged and tapped into that intersectionality to create this amazing career that you now have? And you're a very highly sought after expert at this point at your young age is incredibly impressive. So let's just start there. How did you figure all this out about who you are?
Sure. I would say that maybe starting off at a younger age, I did not intentionally or consciously seek out to learn more about myself. I wouldn't say that I was just so mature beyond my age to say, oh yeah, emotional intelligence is so important for development. So I will somewhat credit some of that to being neurodiverse and the fact that I am not very externally motivated. I'm intrinsically motivated. And so that way I'm constantly evaluating how I feel about something, or constantly evaluating what choices I should make to achieve desired result. I'm very analytical and I'm very goal oriented. So it's always been in my nature, neurologically, to be that way. what I realized that I needed to do though was to be more conscious and deliberate in how I was assessing myself. Not being so hard on myself, not necessarily trying to always find the what's wrong with me, my weaknesses. As interviewees always say, like, oh, what's your weakness? I chose not to focus on that and not to see the things that you listed about me as disadvantages, rather opportunities to see the world differently. So when I changed my perspective, and this was, roughly when I was like, I graduated high school very early. So I was put in a position at 15 years old to figure out what I was gonna do in my life. Very, very young. I would not recommend it.
No.
So I was I had no mentorship. I had no one to help me. So I was like, okay, how am I going to figure this out? I know where I'm strong at. I know that I have talents in certain areas, but I also know, again, that I have limitations, with learning disabilities, my speech impediment and stuttering. How can I make a plan for myself to achieve my goals? In order to do that, I had to be very, very honest with myself about who I was. A lot of people, when they think about setting goals and then being successful and achieving all of these great things, they bypass self-awareness and introspection, in which they have to know who they are right now. They have to know, look themselves in the mirror and say, this is where I'm strong at. Here are some of my limitations. And again, I continue to say limitations versus weaknesses because I feel like it frames it a little bit differently. A limitation simply implies that this is, again, a limit. This is where, if I do the best I can, this is where there is still a blocker. And with any other blocker, usually you can reach out to resources for accommodations. So looking at them as limitations enable me to empower myself to say, you know what, I'm doing the best I can, but I do need resources to help me in these areas. So I framed it by saying, if I define myself, if I define who I am, what I want to do in my life, what my financial situation is, and I always say financial situation, not that I want to be rich and a millionaire. I say, what's my financial situation, where I want to live, and these other specific components. I'm able to be really honest with myself and say, this is who I am. This is what I have to bring to the table. This is what I need to be successful. Take it or leave it, So I think that it's just the high level of self-awareness that most people bypass that really is very, very important. Then you get into self-management skills where you start learning about communication skills. You start learning about time management, prioritization, et cetera, in order to be good at your job.
Yeah. So a couple of things there to dive into. I love your self-awareness, and so many of us, especially when we're young in our careers, we look at other people who we perceive to be successful, right? Because they have the shiny new car or the big house or the right cufflinks or whatever it might be that we're interpreting as success. But I love how you define success on your terms,
yes,
right? Because it has to work for what was meaningful to you. And that is such a huge lesson that most people do not learn at 15, 16, or even 20, or even 40, right? Sure. Most of us are always comparing ourselves to someone else. And the crazy thing about that is that comparison isn't real. It's like listening to supermodels say, guys, I don't actually look like that. Like, even a supermodel doesn't look like a supermodel. So it's just this false reality that we continue to compare ourselves to. And you had the awareness to recognize that, right? And you and I had a prep session for this meeting, or for this session today. And in that, you shared with me something that's not in your kind of bio that I read earlier, is that you are also considered or proclaimed as savant, right? So that took you, right, that high level of performing, whether it's academically or musically, and I think it's manifested itself for you in several different ways. But that's what, you graduated from high school or completed high school at 15. I think it's really important that we understand that just didn't happen, right? You weren't handed that. Somebody said, oh, well, it's time to age you out because we can't do anything else with you. It was, you got this. Like you have so far excelled academically, right? So it wasn't just that you were being dropped out of high school. Completed it, right? Which is
I did complete, yes.
Yeah, right. And that you can't bypass the introspection. That was another thing you said that I just so important. And I'm a huge follower of Dr. Brene Brown. I'm sure you're familiar with her work. You do. And I can't remember if it was a podcast or something I saw on YouTube where she was interviewing someone, and they were talking about the phrase, the grass is always greener on the other side of the fence, right? And that they actually did a study about this, and that it confuses our brain. The way the earth is curved, which is very subtle, right? You don't actually see the curve of the earth when you're standing on the earth. However, when you are standing here and you're looking across the street at your neighbor's yard or over there at your neighbor's yard, the grass literally does look greener. It is an optical illusion with the way the light hits it and reflects off of the grass. But if you were to go stand in their yard, it wouldn't look this bright, lush green that you see from far away. Yeah. And that just came right back to me when you were talking about that self-awareness and not comparing yourself to everyone else. We have to remember that the grass isn't greener. It's the same grass, right? We were all standing in the same damn grass most of the time. Yeah. So figuring out how we navigate through it and how we tap into who we are is so valuable. And you really have done that. And I also love that you have not allowed shame, or at least that I've seen or we've talked about. You've said they're limitations, not weaknesses, because you've removed the shame from that to say, look, this is who I am and it's okay. And how long does it take so many of us in the world to do that? Especially a lot of the folks in my audience are human resources professionals, leaders within organizations, and we wear these masks. Right. Last week, I was talking to Justin Guarini about this. He's a confidence coach, and we wear masks when we go into an interview. We wear masks when we go in to do a presentation where we're trying to influence a CEO or a board to say, let's adopt this new philosophy, this new whatever. We want to invest in this for our people. Instead of bringing our whole selves, oftentimes we bring in a marginalized version of ourselves because we think that's what people want to hear or want to see. You figured out a way to not do that and still find an amazing path and success. And you shared with me yesterday, you do a lot of that with data. And I would love for the audience to hear a bit about, we were talking yesterday about how you've been able to influence organizations to invest in their people, to invest in the right programs through data of what it costs them when they don't. And I would love for you to kind of walk us through how do you do that? How do you influence organizations to make the changes that you believe are necessary?
Sure. So yeah, we did talk a little bit about how do I come at being a consultant and being a subject matter expert, being completely myself while also trying to drive change. And we talked a little bit about some of the challenges that I do face. So first going through the challenges, being your organic self can cause issues if you are not the norm. If you're not typically dressed or you don't look the same way that everyone expects you to look, if you're not in the typical box or you don't fit within that box. In addition to you, of course, having to perform, you also have to jump over those hurdles as well. And so, that is something definitely that early on in my career, I had to figure out how to address, considering that I'm Black, and so I'm a minority. I'm also very much so younger than everyone around me. So it's already the implication here is like, there's this kid trying to tell me what to do with my company. If I'm hired on into a company, whether it be HR team, which I work a lot with, it could be a product team, UX team, it generally means that there is a problem and that the current individuals within that company, not saying that they are the problem, but that their solutions did not address it, meaning that I'm already coming into a very hostile, a lot of times, environment in which it doesn't mean, just because, say, leadership said, Diem, come in and do this, doesn't mean that everyone on the team is in agreement that I should be there and I deserve to be in the first place. So that's already something to think about when I come into those problems, those situations, like, okay, what's the environment like? Psychologically speaking, how engaged or how open are they to this information I'm giving? So I think about that before I even step into the situation, so I can say, okay, what's the best way of communicating to them, considering that, again, I've talked to leadership and they've told me that this problem is going on for a year. They've told me where they think the problem is coming from, and they say it might be the HR team. So then if they told me they think it's the HR team, they probably already told the HR team they think it's the HR team, meaning that the HR team feels blamed for a situation that may not be their fault. If I go in and my job is to validate that they're wrong, they're not going to want to listen to me very much. So those type of things that I think about long before I ever actually engage with whoever my stakeholder or my audience is. It's important to really think about that. Going beyond that, I'm like, okay, so let me come up with some data. Let me start doing my homework. It could be a market analysis. It could be looking through some of the data that already exists in the HR, retention data, hiring data, all of these things. So that way, when I come and present some recommendations, or at least figure out where to start my discovery effort of figuring out what the problem is, I come in with, some kind of knowledge to their very specific situation. Again, being very, very data driven as much as possible. So then when I'm going into the conversation, again, I'm coming in knowing who my audience is, knowing kind of psychologically where they may be at, then doing my homework on where they are and identifying some of the challenges that maybe have been overlooked, but then having a very open mind to the new information. I'm always, as a user researcher especially, you're constantly open to new information, constantly open to feedback. I don't assume that because I did, some data analytics and that I talked to their leadership that I understand from maybe their perspective what's actually going on. So just continuously gathering additional information and refining my assumptions and my hypotheses based off this new information, and keeping it as conversational, like more of a workshopy type of environment, to make sure that I'm staying on the level of those I'm talking with and not coming off like above them, not coming off as better, not coming off as knowing everything. It usually really helps with making sure that people can hear and understand what I'm saying to them, and not be so threatening. And again, I still do that with my t-shirt and my cap on, and I do that intentionally because the way I see it is, regardless of what I'm wearing, regardless of my skin, regardless of my gender identity, regardless of any other thing that was listed in that one post that I have, I know that I have the credentials. I know that I come with, models and frameworks, and that track record of being able to perform efficiently, and that confidence and that self-awareness of knowing what value I bring to the table. If you go in defining yourself, if you go in knowing your value and what you are capable of doing, really no one can tell you otherwise. So whether I'm in a $50,000 suit or something, or in a $5 t-shirt, my value stays the same, and I am comfortable and solid in that understanding. And that's really something, again, that comes from introspection and self-awareness before presenting yourself out there and putting yourself out there for people to then judge and define themselves. This is going to happen regardless.
It is, absolutely. I can't agree with you more. And one of the things, I'll reflect last week on the session I had with Justin, he was talking about when he's a performer, he's an artist, he performs on Broadway, and he was on American Idol. And so auditioning is a big part of his life. And when he goes into an audition, he had to reframe that. Instead of going in saying like, please, please, please hire me, offer me the job, he reframed it with, I get to go in and show you who I am. And just be authentically that. And if that resonates with you, great. If it doesn't, okay, right? It's okay for both of us, because it likely wouldn't work anyway, right? If you force it. Yeah. How do you build that relationship with folks when you're coming in, right? With your hat on and your t-shirt, and you don't look like they do, likely, right? You're probably not often walking into a room full of other Black men with dreads, or non-binary folks with dreads and baseball hats, right? So how do you break through some of that to be relatable, and how do you use your superpowers to build those relationships?
Sure. I spoke a little bit already, kind of going into the situation, knowing a bit more about your audience. I went through a dissertation process for my PhD, and most people, when they think of PhDs, are like, oh, that really brainy, smart person uses big words. When in reality, when you go through that dissertation process, you're actually learning a lot about how to appropriately communicate with others in a way that is simplified, So taking all those complex terminology and models and frameworks and actually converting it into a way that people understand. And so I look at this, take the same research approach. How can it's referred to as dissemination of findings. How can I disseminate the information in a way that is easy to understand, approachable, and can be utilized? Because at the end of the day, if it can't be used to make decisions, if it can't be used to make change, it really is useless, whatever we're trying to do. So I go in before even talking with them. I go in and think about that, and make a strategy around that before ever walking into a room. Because the one thing about my neurodiversity is that I'm very strategic and very coordinated and planned in my social interactions. So because I am unable to necessarily go through social interaction or engagements and just know emotionally I should do this, or, you know, I should physically do that, or whatever the case may be. It basically forces me then to reflect on it before and say, okay, what is the most appropriate, you know, thing to say here, and when should I do this? And it actually really fares very well for being able to be perceived as someone who's very thoughtful or considerate, because I literally have to be both of those things in order to engage with a high level of normalcy. Mm-hmm. So with that level of consideration that I have to give, I usually apply that in those situations. Say, okay, well, let's consider again who it is. These are leadership. You know, I'm sitting with a bunch of executives, and these are their biggest high level problems. Look them up on LinkedIn and say, okay, these are the type of things that they're interested in. These are the type of things that they engage with. These are their priorities. How can I communicate, you know, a way that resonates with them? How do I make sure that they understand what I'm saying, considering I'm looking at some of the certifications they have and it's not in the same area of interest. Therefore, they likely don't maybe understand what I'm saying in this area. It's the high level of thoughtfulness and empathy that's required to really be a good communicator, especially when you are presenting challenges or even solutions that they may not necessarily accept.
Yeah.
And looking the way I do, it definitely amplifies the need to do that.
So for folks who may not know this about you, is that you shared with me, you don't always, sometimes you might, but you don't always pick up on social cues and clues that other people might be more sensitive to. Yes. Right? And that's part of where you are on the spectrum with, whether it's with autism or wherever you might land in that space, right? So you have to go into meetings thinking ahead of time, okay, make sure I'm paying attention to when people are laughing. Make sure I'm paying attention to when they sit back and they're not buying into what I have to say, right? You are consciously thinking about all of those cues and clues that are happening.
Yes.
At the same time, you're trying to deliver a message, right? So the complexity of what's happening in your head is pretty amazing when you think about it, right? Because a lot of that social awareness is more natural for others, right? I can read a room in a different way than you can. And so what I want our audience to take away from this is how, and the way I promoted this session today was, what do we have in common, right? There's the list of all the things that make you, you. And then when you look at the things that make me, me, there's not a whole lot of overlap there, right? So it's quite interesting. But at the same time, when we think about the 5 imperatives for HR professionals that I wrote, the first one is to be a business leader first, who works in the people space, right? And what does that mean? Know your business, speak the language of your business, understand where your stakeholders are coming from and what's important to them, which is basically what you just talked about, right?
Yep.
Exactly what you talked about. The second one is to be agile and adaptable. Stop being the HR policy police, right? And that's certainly something we want to talk about, but stop being the HR policy police and start understanding that we've got to adapt to what's going on in the market, to what's going on in our organizations. And we have to iterate and be agile, and we can't be restricted by rigid policy and fear of lawsuits, right?
Continuously collecting feedback, continuously solutioning, providing different ideas. Yep, definitely.
And then simple. I love that you said that. The third or the fourth imperative is practical solutions, which I define as simple. And does it actually meet the need, right? If it takes more than 5 minutes and an interpretive dance to explain your concept, it's too complicated, right? We've got to simplify and allow things to organically unfold so that it becomes intuitive for people. So there is actually a lot of alignment between the way we approach the work we do. And I want the folks who work in the people space, in the HR world, to understand adapting an agile mentality in HR doesn't mean you have to just vacate everything you've always done. It's iterative, right? And it's adopting one thing at a time. And then you can, over time, develop this great skill set of being a business leader who works in the people space. And, we talked a little bit about the HR policy police yesterday, and you shared a great example, because one of the things that's really difficult for folks in HR, because we walk the line, right? We walk the line of being aligned with our organization and being that people advocate and creating that people first work environment and culture. But at the same time, there's often a very unspoken underlying fear culture that exists within the HR space, because we're constantly straddling what's right to do for the organization, what's best to do for our people. And there's always that threat of litigation and lawsuits, that policy and laws and rules and guidelines that plague the folks who work in the HR space often. And organizations will revert back to, well, we can't do that because we could be sued. And you shared with me a way you were able to overcome some of that with one of the groups you've worked with or a company you worked with.
Sure. Yeah.
And you did it by proving out the financials. And I love that perspective. Can you share with us a little bit about what that was like and what you were solving for and how you did that?
Sure. So in this particular project, again, I work a lot of times with HR. It's where I got my start in my field. But one of the biggest challenges that, like you mentioned, they faced are not wanting to make changes to their policies or make changes to their organizational, processes, is because they are fearful of, possibly getting sued, or, some kind of claims being put against them, EEO type of cases. So what I did was I was like, okay, well, be very specific. What type of lawsuit do you think that you're likely to face if we were to make a specific change? So I had done my research, did a lot of employee engagement surveys, did user interviews, all these things, presented recommendations. And so like for each recommendation, tell me specifically the type of lawsuit that you think that you would get. Right? So they did. They're like, okay, they're throwing out like, oh, this type of lawsuit or this lawsuit example. So I was like, okay, so what I did was I took this data and I was like, okay, I'm going to go and do some homework as far as let's figure out how frequently these lawsuits actually take place, especially in this industry, in this population, this area, et cetera, et cetera. And then I figured out the average of how much, the lawsuits actually the company paid out. Again, I'm very data driven. So I'm like, okay, we're going to see the frequency, we're going to see the occurrences, we're going to see the circumstances in which it happened. And then we're going to say how much is actually going to get paid out if it actually happens. So I was able to provide them a percentage as far as how likely it would happen, so like, yeah, it's like, 15% chance. And then it'll cost you, $1.8 million if you were to have to pay out. And if you didn't go to court. Gave them a complete scenario, and then told them what I provided them. They're like, oh, well, thank you. So now we have this data to support our decision. It's like, well, I'm not done yet, because another part of that is just look at the numbers if we if we don't make the changes from the employee standpoint or the people standpoint. So looking at additional metrics that they had not even considered. So I was like, okay, if we don't make this change to the way that you're going about hiring people, you will continue to have a very low offer acceptance rate. Because right now it's very bad, which means this is how much you're currently spending on recruitment strategies and techniques and ads and hiring on additional recruiters and hiring on this additional sourcer that now you have to cover by expanding your recruitment team and all their laptops and their cell phones and the mileage that they're putting on their cars and the events that you guys are taking on. I calculated all these expenses basically around recruitment. Then I also put in the training expenses. So here's the additional orientations that you now have to conduct because you guys are spending through people. And basically I calculated all these expenses, sold them. So for the 1.8 million that you might for 15% chance, deal with, here is the 8.3 million that you're going to actually face if you don't make these changes, because the retention is going to be poor and your onboarding structure is ineffective, and the training costs because of the fact that you need to bring more trainers on, et cetera, it's going to, so basically showing the numbers next to each other and then showing a bunch of factors that they had not actually considered beforehand really kind of illustrated a more full and well-rounded picture to show the importance of employee experience and to show the importance of candidate experience, applicant experience, and really making sure that we consider them because they are people, and these people are what drive your business. Employees drive your businesses, not all of these, not saying that other things are not important, but if you don't prioritize your most valuable resource in your company, it has a financial impact that most people think, or they don't see. It's like, okay, well, 1.8 million, I see that. It's tangible, it's on a piece of paper, it's right there in front of me. But you don't see all the additional costs associated with not doing it, even including things that are not something you can quantify, like your employer brand and how your employer brand impacts your consumer brand. Because again, if your employees talk very badly about you to their friends and family, they would be your biggest advocate to sell your product. But now they're like, I'm not buying from there. My cousin works there and he hates that company. Those are types of residual impacts that it has on it. So those are things that you have to really continuously consider when you're not prioritizing your people, because there is both a financial impact and then a brand impact. And those are really big for any company.
I love everything you just said. First of all, let me just let everybody just take all that in for a minute, right? That approach of using data is so important. And when we think about influencing and informing, right, that is the third of or the second of the 5 imperatives that I talk about pretty frequently. Our role as human resources professionals or people who work in the people space is fundamentally to influence and inform the decisions our organizations make as it relates to the people who work within the company. That is a fundamental core, pillar of our existence. And when we can influence and inform decisions by using data, experience, and I believe our intuition, our superpower of how you connect the dots between those, right? Because data in and of itself doesn't tell the whole story.
It does not.
Right? Because we all know we can make data say and do lots of different things, right? Yeah. And there's a difference between truth and facts, and data can be used for one or the other. Mm-hmm. But when you combine that data, those facts, with the experience you have, either your experience within that organization to know what the cultural norms are, or your experience with other organizations and how things could be different. And then you layer all of that with your gut, your instinct, your intuition that tells you something's right or something's not right. And the more we tune into that, we really have this superpower of being able to truly influence decisions. And the example you just shared of quantifying those costs, those unspoken, unrecognized costs that are absolutely off the charts when you think about repairing the reputation of an organization when their culture has tanked, mm-hmm. and their Glassdoor ratings are dismal and people are leaving and they can't retain help. It's huge. It's huge.
Long lasting is there's no Band-Aid a lot of times when you get to that point. That's another thing too. It becomes a very long, expensive organizational change management initiative, and you're going to cost a lot more than 1.8 that you were scared about. That's for sure.
100%. And there is no silver bullet, like you said, right? It's not, there's no switch that you can flip that says, oh, okay, tomorrow we're going to have a great culture and we're going to do this. It is a slow process because you're not only creating likely an external marketing campaign, but you have to now internally change everything that got you in that place in the first place. Yes. And convincing your current employees that it's actually different is significantly harder than that external, right?
It's such a great mistrust that you've already built within a company. And the thing about it is harder than it sounds to fix in the first place. Consider my example. It was related to onboarding and the initial problem was offer acceptance rates. And I unveiled a larger problem than that. But the problem here is that when you have, say, an example, low offer acceptance rates, you start just sending out to anybody who's going to say, yes, I'm going to hire you. And that is a trickle-down effect to now you have unqualified people within your organization. How do you now weed them out? Now it's a performance evaluation problem because now you have to figure out how do you determine who is qualified, who's not qualified, who's causing challenges, who's not. Are they now leaders? You see, so it does cause very long-term, long-standing problems that are now embedded within your culture and the processes. Then now it's hard to define what's good and bad at that point. So it definitely is very important.
And I find that very few organizations, this is a lot of the work that I have recently been doing, is operationalizing your organizational's values, right? There's these words on the walls, or they're in your orientation packet, or they're on your career page. But if you haven't truly operationalized that and defined what those values mean for your company, and then how you apply them and how you hold people to them and take ownership, then you're never going to have that end-to-end employee experience through line that we know has to exist to create that people first culture that has profitability, sustainability, and scalability, right? It just doesn't work without that foundational piece. And like you just said, not any one of those pieces are standalone, right? They're all so integrated that you can't just pull one thing out and say, okay, we're going to fix this and it's going to fix everything, because this is just one piece.
Often it's a symptom. By the time that leadership has identified that it is a problem, or that some area that they should focus on, it likely is simply a symptom of something else in the first place. And so, if say IO psychologists or HR is getting involved, it is because the symptom has become so severe that it's demanded leadership's attention. Meaning that, in all honesty, it's a way bigger problem than they think it is.
Yes. So I can give you guys an example of this. One of the clients I had worked with last year, the person I was coaching, she was HR VP. She said, I feel like every day I go into work chasing chaos. Every day. I'm just constantly, it's just chasing this problem and this problem and this problem. And I said, okay, well, that's a symptom of something else. Chaos in and of itself is not the problem. It is a symptom of something else. And so we started diving into all of the different things. And when I asked her about the values of the company, this particular organization, one of their company values is get shit done. Literally, that's it. GSD is one of their company values. Now, it's not good or bad in and of itself, but if all you're measuring is the result, do you not think that's going to create internal chaos? If all you're measuring is the end piece, right? That's a very Machiavellian kind of society. And unfortunately, the how is just as important, if not more important, than the result or the what. And so when I was able to get her to see that, she was then able to do a lot of analysis around performance reviews. And lo and behold, the number one top rated value in the company was GSD. And I said, okay, well, let's look at that. Are your salespeople stepping over each other? Are they stealing each other's clients? I'm guessing these things are what's happening. And she's like, how did you know all of that? Because you have unintended consequences by creating this value within your organization and not defining what it means to you, because now everybody's interpreting it on their own terms, which you can't blame them for, because in the absence of information, people make it up themselves. So now this whole get shit done has taken on a whole new life. It's no longer about being focused and productive. Now it's about being cutthroat so that you can be at the top of the pyramid. And that's not healthy. So I love how you broke it all down, because it really is creating that entire life cycle experience, and not one thing can do it in and of itself. Right? We have to have that whole experience piece. So thank you for breaking that down. When you work, I'm going to switch gears here a little bit. We talked about this yesterday a bit as well. We see folks in HR often posting things about they're the pseudo attorney and the pseudo therapist and the pseudo this and that, kind of the jack of all trades. And when I see that, I cringe, right? Because I think, no, guys, stop. You're not a therapist. You're not an attorney. You're not this. You are an amazing professional who works in the HR or the people space, and own that and be great at that. But understand that by kind of wearing the mask of all of these other roles that you're not necessarily qualified for, unless you are. I mean, if you are an attorney, that's great. Or if you are a licensed therapist, that's great. But very few of us in HR actually are those things. But establish partnerships and relationships with people who really do have that level of expertise, because I think we're doing ourselves a disservice by trying to wear all of these hats and be all things to all people, versus being that strategic focus of all things that relate to the people experience. And we talked about that. I'd love your perspective. When you see those types of things, like, what does that say to you, and how do you respond?
Sure. Well, this would even not even just be specific to HR, but anyone who identifies themselves as being like this universal know-it-all, I have all the answers type of person. A lot of times, from my experience doing coaching myself, it is a lack of identity. Like, if you don't truly understand, again, back to self-awareness, where you bring the most value, where your skill sets lie, what you're the subject matter expert in, then you will try to gravitate towards every little thing that you think like, well, you have a little win here and a small win there, and external validation in this area. So if you can answer this one question about this legal problem, and they took your word for it, and it makes you feel good, like, oh, dopamine, like, oh yeah, you know what, I'm good at that. However, again, that doesn't really allow for you to be the best at what you can actually do. I would never claim, even with me, those avantism and my information processing ability allows me to do a lot of things. So I use myself as example. And so basically I can draw. I have some behind me. I can draw pretty perfect replications of things that I see. I also can play music, because I can hear it and then be able to mimic it. I have data analytic ability, so I can process information and numbers very quickly, right? Had I, though, went about my career saying, I'm going to do all those things, I'm going to be a musician and an artist, and I'm going to be, a data analyst and data scientist, I wouldn't have been really great at anything. I would have simply tried to divide my attention to so many different areas that in reality, I would not be very good in most of them compared to someone who maybe is more neurotypical, who just dedicated themselves to that one thing. So even with my, advanced ability to do it, I still would fall short in those areas. With HR, if we're looking at HR as this, anything that we need to get done, throw it to HR, then how is HR actually able to be great at the things that would bring the most value to the company if HR were great at it, And that's the problem here, is that we need HR. HR serves a vital role. And if HR is now divided up into 15, 20 different areas, then HR's value is actually a lot lower than someone on the street saying, I can do that. I can now do that thing better than what HR is doing. And so everyone in your organization will be able to do that one thing. So if you say you're legal and you say you're a therapist, and you say you're a manager, right? Well, that legal team is going to be better than you at doing legal, because that's what they do. The therapist and the psychologists are going to be better than you. So everyone is still going to be technically better than HR at doing what they do, because HR is trying to do things, trying to do everything. So it's something really to consider is your identity and your self-awareness, and saying, this is what I bring to the table. This is what I'm really good at. This is what I'm going to build. If you're an HR leader, I'm going to build my team around delivering this value. That way you can then brand that value and say, team can be a part of, your leadership meetings on this topic, because we can bring you this value. This is how we deliver. This is our process that we make sure to operationalize this. And this is what you're going to see. Here's some artifacts to show you examples of how we can, communicate with you. This is when you interject us. This is when you include us in your meetings, et cetera, et cetera. But you can't do that if you're trying to do 15 different things, because again, you will never be the best. HR will always be second best to the team who actually can do it better. And then you won't be utilized the way you should be. So self-awareness of what you can do, building that brand around that is so critical.
Oh my gosh. I'm going to take just that piece of this video and share it everywhere. I can't applaud loudly enough the fact that when you become the catch-all, you dilute your value each and every single time.
Easily beaten by anyone who focuses only on that. Like you just
right. And it's also how I think HR has, when we look back over time of how this function has evolved, it was always just the necessary evil, the afterthought, right? It was never truly considered a business function. And we have to change that, because we do have
value. Exactly. Focus in on that.
Focus in on what we really do. We are people strategists. We are the people who connect the dots between business outcomes, strategic objectives, and the people who bring it together. We're one of the only functions in an organization that actually interacts with each and every department within a company. And we should be able to connect the dots for them. They come to us because they need help with that, not because they need advice that an attorney could give them. Right? Exactly. Have attorneys for that. And I've experienced this at one organization I worked at. The business partners, they were so busy all the time. And I couldn't figure it out, right? I'm like, what is keeping you so busy? Because the work I need you to do around people strategy and analyzing exit data and all of this, you don't seem to be able to get to that, but you're so busy all the time. So I sat with them. And in one day, I was like, I cannot believe this is the work you're sitting here doing. I was new to the organization, but HR somehow became the owners of ordering steel-toed boots for employees, setting up eye exams for people because they needed prescription PPE eyewear. There were all of these things that had nothing to do with people strategy, right? But we were the catch-all because, oh, well, somebody in ops decided they didn't want to do it anymore. And they said, well, HR can help us out. We've got to set our boundaries around what we're here to do and hold to that. And when I'm coaching an HR team and we're going through kind of the transformation of old school HR to disruptive, progressive people strategists, one of the first things we do is we need to create our purpose statement.
Exactly.
Why are you here? Why do you exist? And what are the things that you do to support that strategy? And then when those catch-all things come your way, that becomes your litmus test, right? Like, does ordering steel-toed boots for people in operations really align with us creating an amazing, onboarding process or talent acquisition? No, it doesn't. I'm sorry, that doesn't belong in HR. Maybe the safety team could take ownership of ordering PPE for our employees.
But you can't push back, though. The thing about it is the biggest problem is you can't push back if they say, okay, then what do you do? And you're saying, oh, well, I'm the, catch-all. I'm the jack of all trades. It kind of goes.
Yes.
You're basically saying that you're jack of all trades, but then you're not able to then differentiate what you actually bring to the table. So then you have to basically say, yeah, well, I guess I will do that because I said I'm the jack of all trades. I said my brand is that. So by scoping in and saying, this is, again, our purpose. This is the value we bring. These are our deliverables. And then next step is operationalizing that and saying, these are our processes. Here we have standard operating procedures in which we do these things in this particular way, in which we can consistently deliver in this way, and we can again include us in these types of accommodations because you start to also kind of control the engagement. So you're not being pulled in a million directions. You think about your resources, say, okay, I have a team of 5. I'm going to build processes around these 5 resources. I'm going to include us maybe in 2 meetings at this level and during this time. You're able to really be very specific and very direct in what you need to be successful, and that way you communicate out to these other teams. If you haven't thought about that, again, it really takes you back to self-awareness. You're just doing team self-awareness. If your team hasn't thought about all of these things, you haven't thought about your limitations, you haven't thought about your team's strengths, you haven't thought about your team's goals and direction, you can't communicate out to other people what you need, the accommodations you need, or your value add. And you can't then present to other people, this is who I am, this is what we do. There you go. So it's same thing as an individual. It does work for a team as well, the same concept.
Yes. And building a team and knowing that you need to complement these strengths and limitations with these strengths and limitations is critical. If you're an HR leader, you've got to look at what is the function of the work you need done, and then how do you have the talent support that?
Exactly.
And it's so important. We've got to, I think, firm up the structure within the people space significantly more than it is today. It's all over the place. And if we want the respect of being a business function, then we need to function like a business.
Yes, you literally do. Yes, you absolutely do. Yes,
absolutely. So
within your team.
Yes, totally. So I know we've got 10 more minutes here, and I know we've got a hard stop at 1. One of the things I think is really interesting to folks is how do you utilize all the different variables that make you, right? With some of and we all have as many unique attributes, right? We just may not identify them as readily as you have, but all of us have things that make us who we are. How do we tap into that and use that to improve experience, whether it's candidate experience, employee experience, customer experience? I know this is a big part of the work you do is, identifying, defining, mapping, and then improving the user experience. And how does all of this that makes you such a special person, how do you tap into that to help improve the user experience?
Sure. I would say probably the biggest one is simply being able to come at things with a higher level of empathy, considering, yourself, like, okay, like, for me, I'm like, okay, so coming into the situation, so for one project, I'll use the example of project, came in, it was another HR team, and they were dealing with having a hard time attracting talent, right, for this particular role. It was like a CNA type of role in pharmacy techs. So for this particular role, especially the area that they're in, it's usually filled by primarily like people of color, right? Because they're like lower level roles and usually doesn't take as much training. So that's who it is. So like they're like, well, we've been doing all of this to try to attract them. And even when we attract them, they leave very quickly. What are the challenges that we're facing here? So I was able to come into this project, and say, okay, maybe one of the challenges here would be where you're recruiting them, and how you're going about recruiting them, because I am considering from my perspective, if you were talking to me like this, or if you were expecting me to be in these places and, across town to go to your job fair where I don't live, like if this is where predominantly people of color live and your job fair is, across town where they have to take 3 buses to get there, things like that would impact their ability to even engage with you, So I was able to say, okay, you know what? I don't think that you're taking you're saying you're trying to be more inclusive and diverse in your hiring, especially for these particular roles where that's predominantly who has certifications for it. But nothing about your policies, nothing about your approaches actually align with that. You're not being very inviting to this, you're fully white staff who's sitting on across the table, evaluating one person. It's like, you got 5, people who look nothing like them, evaluating them all at once. That may not be very inviting to think this is a diverse workspace.
Right.
Things like that, when I am in that position where I sat in, in that role and had to face those type of challenges, it allows me to understand from their perspective what they're going through. So by considering what makes you different, considering some of the challenges that you face, considering, how you would have liked something to have happened, it really allows you to have a level of empathy and sympathy towards how to improve someone else's experience. Just because it was some people, and I really hate this ideology, is like, well, it was hard for me, or I had to go through a tough time, so it's just a rite of passage, or it's just the way that things are. When in reality, you should reflect on what made something difficult for you. Why was it so challenging? And how can you use your position of power or your role within this company to make it better for the next person who might be in the exact same shoes as you, same skin as you, the same types of, whatever, how you categorize yourself as you, and how could you make that easier for them? That's the way I look at it. And I look at of course, there are other factors that of course come into play, like data that I supports why I make certain, recommendations. But that is a very big one for me, is making sure that I make it easier for the next person coming along. If there's another eye psychologist, maybe they're 10, maybe they're in elementary school right now, they don't even know it, but there's a future eye psychologist coming who's going to look very similar to me, who's going to be very similar in a lot of ways than I am. And I want to make sure that I'm creating policies and making regulations that makes it easier for that kid, that in the future IO to be, to do their job successfully. That's the way I look at it.
Mm-hmm. And there's such a huge, focus right now on DE&I, and it makes me sad that we're still having to have these conversations. But the reality is, I'm also glad that the conversations are happening, right? It's that duality of, okay, guys, we got to get there. We've got to make these changes. But when you think about, generationally speaking, a lot of folks, the arguments that we hear, and typically it's, white men of, a certain socioeconomic status, who rail against the fact that, well, I didn't have privilege. I worked for everything I had and nobody did that. And trying to convince them that, yes, you actually do have privilege. And
Sure.
The whole conversation in and of itself. But when you take your experiences as someone who has been homeless, someone who, has had all of these challenges, and yet you paved your own way by tapping into what all of those challenges taught you and how it made you who you are. I think about my life experience and how I utilize that to connect with customers or potential clients or candidates. I think it's so important. And instead of wearing the mask and trying to pretend that that's not what makes us who we are, tapping into it to allow others to see us as fully who we are, it helps, I believe it helps level the playing field in some ways, right? Because people recognize that, they can relate to it, and then they're like, wow, if that person can do that, maybe I can do that. And it gives them that hope of changing the outcome that's been so ingrained in them, right? Because I think one of the things you shared was that when you were younger, there was a finite number of outcomes for your life that you had been told, right? Yeah. And it was drug dealer,
athlete, like a rapper,
athlete,
jail.
Right?
Yeah, they weren't very good. They weren't.
Right. None of them resonated with you, right? So you decided to create your own path, and so we all have to do that in one way or another. And we may not have the challenges that you've had to overcome, but there's still challenges, and they're still relevant, and they still can contribute to making you an amazing person. Yeah. And I think that's when we talk about intersectionality and how we can tap in and leverage that. You don't have to be Black, and non-binary and have dreads and all of these things, right? I'm a white female lesbian musician who also works in the people space, who loves animals, and I have 2 kids with my wife and all, right? Like, so there's things that make me who I am that are completely different than the things that make you who you are. And yet we still come to so many of these same conclusions because we recognize that it's our humanity that connects us. And tapping into that just makes it a better place for all of us, whether you're talking work culture or just, you know, life in general. And I think that's so beautiful how you've been able to bring that forward. So I applaud you so much. And I love following all of what you're doing. Because I just find it so fascinating, right? I'm like, I want to work with Diem so badly now. I'm like, I've got to find a project for us to work on together because it's just so exciting. And one of the things you just talked about is work that's happening right now as we're facing the Great Resignation or the Great Migration. People are calling it one of 2 things, where you know, it's anticipated that 40% of people are going to resign and move to another organization because they want to work where they want to work. They want to have flexibility, ownership over their career, ownership over their life, which I applaud and I think it's wonderful. But so a lot of organizations are starting to ramp up their talent acquisition, their recruiting processes, but a lot of them don't really know how. And so they call me because I have really deep roots in TA, and I've, you know, facilitated the hiring of, you know, 50,000 people throughout my career. I've worked in really high volume recruiting. And by identifying what you just said is identifying the people you want to hire. So those CNAs, if they're predominantly Black and they're predominantly lower socioeconomic earners because of all of these other things, you need to place your ads where they are organically going to be.
Communicate the culture in a way that aligns with that audience.
Yes, but not in a way that is showing pity, right? It has to be
stereotypical nature. Yeah, no.
Right, exactly. So, you know, there is a fine art to that, but once you get it and you figure it out, it's like, oh my gosh, this is amazing, because now we're attracting the right people who love this work, and we love those people and we want them to be part of who we are, because look at all the value that they're adding and how we can help them. And it's just such a huge part of what I think organizations need to really tap into right now if they're going to, you know, make it through the next 12 to 18 months with this disruption of employee base.
I'm sure you'll be very busy.
Let's hope so. Let's hope so. So I know you have a hard stop in 3 minutes. I thank you so much for everything you shared with us.
Of course.
I hope you'll come back and join us again. I know that I could talk to you for hours, and I'm serious. I'm going to find work for us to do together, because I think it would be so much fun and just really beneficial for everybody involved. But thank you, my friend. I will be reaching out to you again, following you. Everybody, if you're not following Diem Mooney on LinkedIn and all the different social places where he is, definitely do that. He's sharing some really great nuggets with all of us every day. So thank you so much, everyone. And I will be back next week, Tuesday noon Eastern Standard Time, right here on LinkedIn Live. And I will post this video along with all the other ones from the table on the YouTube channel. So if you weren't able to make it live, you can certainly subscribe to the YouTube channel and get notified as soon as it's uploaded there. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Diem. Have a wonderful afternoon, and we will talk again soon. All right. I'm going to sign off now.